what we did this morning was inductively demonstrate all the things we're going to talk about for the rest of the day. So now we'll apply theory on top of what you already know. So this is reverse pedagogy, right? You already have the knowledge, and now we talk about some theory that allows you to structure your knowledge. So I changed the title slightly from what was in the program. So I want to highlight this idea of navigating the diverse values of nature, both in research and the science policy interface. Yesterday, we saw presentations, and you all know we face this global crisis of biodiversity, of climate change, of pollution. In the case of the IPBES values assessment, we said that it's actually a crisis of values. It's not a crisis, it's not a triple crisis. So it's a values crisis. But also, natural scientists have couched this, and this image is meant to represent what's called the Anthropocene. We've all heard the term Anthropocene. But social scientists and indigenous and local communities have said it's not a human nature problem, because it's not humanity that's causing this, it's specific social practices. And if they're social practices, we can change them. If it's a condition of our species, there's nothing we can do about it. And so what we now realize is that different worlds commingle in the same space. This isn't a human nature problem, it's a social nature problem. So for example, these are different social imaginaries that have influenced the Americas since colonization by Europeans. So we have an initial colonization of white Europeans who consider dominating nature as something good, which also allows genocide, it allows exterminating species based on the idea that we're improving nature. Those same white Europeans, 100 years later, decided that nature was paradise, and they wanted to make national parks, that they would allow us to have this protected. Nature is the Garden of Eden. And in the last 30 or 40 years, we have this idea of the crisis, the environmental crisis, where we're now disassociated from nature. But what's important to recognize, even in the Americas, this is commingling with other worldviews that didn't experience this process. This is the white European version of the Americas. And at the same time, commingles with social imaginaries like Pachamama or Buen Vivir. Of course, this doesn't just happen in the Americas. Around the world, we have different ways of expressing human-nature relationships, whether it's in Japan with the concept of productive landscapes, Sotoyama, or the sub-Saharan African concept of Ubuntu. In the case of the Andes, we often refer to Sumak Kausai, or ways of living well. So these alternative social imaginaries have existed and coexist everywhere. So it's not a human nature problem, it's a social nature problem, and we have plenty of other social relationships upon which to build more positive and just and sustainable futures. So why do conceptual models matter? From a disciplinary perspective, we could say that human nature concepts have evolved since the 1960s, where early on maybe anthropologists studied humans and biologists studied nature. Since the concept of the environmental crisis, biologists all of a sudden said, oh, humans affect nature in a negative way, so they're an impact on nature. Since the 1990s, mostly ecologists with some economists started saying, well, what are the benefits we get from nature? Ecological economics. And then in the last 10 or 20 years, we're in this phase of deciding how do we address social ecological systems as reciprocal systems, not as one direction. But here, it's not just how we organize our universities and whether or not we have different departments or whether we have programs. This also has real-world implications with how we manage nature. For example, if we consider humans and nature separate, it's sufficient to have protected areas and sacrifice areas. If we consider humans a disturbance of nature, it's sufficient to have clean water, clean air legislation. If we consider nature as a benefit to humans, it's sufficient to pay for those ecosystem services. But if we are now trying to strive to implement transdisciplinarity, social ecological systems thinking, we're in this phase of co-management and inclusive government. And we're in the phase, this is literally a time sequence where now we're in the last 20 years trying to say, what does this mean in practice? And that's why we're here today. Just to show that this paradigm shift, at least, well, this paper is now 20 years old, or 10 years old. We did an analysis of the terms of publications in ecology and sustainability journals that use the term social ecological. And what we found was that since about 2006, there's an exponential increase, and this was only until 2013. So you can imagine now that exponential increase is going full force. But this is in academics, so we're not weird. This is real. It's not in our heads that there's a paradigm shift. There's an actual paradigm shift in publications about an integrated perspective rather than these one-directional perspectives or disciplinary perspectives. But perhaps more importantly is that this paradigm shift is being expressed in decision-making. So in December of 22, in the COP15 for biodiversity, which was in Montreal, it's called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework because the meeting started in Kunming and ended in Montreal because of COVID. How many of you are familiar with the outputs of the Global Biodiversity Framework? What's the main target that everyone talks about? 30 by 30, thank you. Well done. So why is this an expression of social ecological systems, or is this an expression of mainstream conservation based on more protected areas? Why would I say that the Global Biodiversity Framework is a paradigm shift if this is the main target? Have any of you read this target? What's missing here? The second half of the target. So there is a mainstream conservation goal, which is 30 by 30, but the second half of that target says that it has to be achieved with equitable and representative and participatory governance that recognizes rights of indigenous people and local communities. So this entire document is embedded with a social ecological perspective. And when you read it, it's actually quite striking that it says crazy words like Mother Earth, cosmovisions, value systems, worldviews, indigenous. These words are all through a biodiversity document. So this paradigm shift is real, at least in the expression of intentions. Now there's the work of materializing it in practice. So in the case of the Convention on Biological Diversity, countries have to prepare what are called national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Are you familiar with these documents? Any of you who work in any country that has a Ministry of Environment, if you don't know what an NBSAP is, you're not referencing what's relevant and legitimate for that decision maker. Christiana and I met each other when we worked on the Americas Assessment for IPBES, the Americas Assessment for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And I remember in our third authors meeting, we had interactions with national focal points of governments. And we'd spent 3 years doing all this literature review, and we had all this information on biodiversity and ecosystem services in the Americas. And the first thing they said was, you didn't cite the NBSAPs. Because for them, that was the only thing that mattered. All the literature, the academic literature was irrelevant. But NBSAPs are the instruments that governments use to materialize these decisions in their action plans locally. So that's what's important. So now, after the meeting in Montreal, there was a meeting in Kenya where countries worked on how do we express the multiple values of nature in our NBSAPs. So this is an actual thing that's happening, and you may be involved in your countries to say, okay, how do we express this in on-the-ground measurements and on-the-ground actions? Because that's still a work to be had. The paradigm shifts happened conceptually, and now we have to operationalize it. I'll also mention that the Gender Action Plan originally was going to be gender inclusive, but because the Convention for Biological Diversity works on consensus, countries who opposed gender that's not expressed as women and girls objected for the gender plan to be inclusive. So it only includes women and girls, not other expressions of gender. So where did this come from? Why does the Convention for Biological Diversity now talk about worldviews instead of just species? Within the realm of our work, most of us, or a lot of us, at least relate a lot to ecology and relate to this concept of ecosystem services. But as a concept, it's pretty new. Within the ecology journals, it was only cited in 1984 by Mooney and Ehrlich as a metaphor for ecosystem processes. They were just using it as a linguistic metaphor. They weren't actually quantifying anything monetarily or socioculturally. They were just saying these things that nature does are like services for people to be able to communicate better with decision makers. But it wasn't until the 1990s that this became sort of a full-blown way of doing research, and the seminal paper, of course, is the Costanza 97 paper, where they asked the question, what is the value of nature? And they put a monetary value per hectare around the world. And this had a huge impact. If we do a similar graph to the one I showed earlier with social ecological terms, if we do that with ecosystem services, it was down here, and then in 97 it does this. There was a before and after with this paper. So it positioned this idea of nature in the terms of goods and services, which of course is economics language. It's using economics metaphors, economics approaches to think that we're communicating better with decision makers. And it, at this early stage, prioritized monetarization of nature. Pretty soon after this publication, there was a global effort called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that formalized this, politicized it, but also broadened the idea from monetarization to the idea of well-being. And so here, ecosystem services contribute to security, material aspects of a good life, health, social relationships, and freedom of choice. So it's not just money. But the political impact of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was very low. It was an academic exercise for and by academics with the idea that it would influence decision making. But once I was with the chief scientist of the US Forest Service, and she said, this is a really great document, but it doesn't answer the questions we were asking. And it's not put into a way that we can now apply it into policy. But it had this huge impact of altering the global discourse, taking an academic concept, politicizing it, globalizing it, and expanding it to include other aspects of well-being beyond monetary well-being. So shortly after the publication of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, these global thought leaders started working on this idea of how can we institutionalize this so that we're not just producing information, but we're also creating legitimate and relevant information for decision makers. And so they created the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which I think on the day that Carlos Joly presents, he will surely go into more depth on this as a science policy interface. But it's created in 2012 under the umbrella of the UN, but it's independent, so it's an independent organization. It has the goal of interfacing conservation, sustainable use, human well-being, and sustainable development. It has more than 145 member states, and it has a secretariat in Bonn, Germany. So how does IPBES create rigorous and legitimate policy information? This is the process of creating one IPBES report. So it's a 4-year process, and it has different levels of scientific rigor and political legitimacy. Scientific rigor is maintained by, for example, the multidisciplinary expert panel, which is called MEP. So all the decisions that happen, there's a group of about 25, I think, scientists who are nominated by their regions of the world. So there's like 2 or 4 per region, basically. And they're sort of the scientific advisors for IPBES. But there's also what's called the Bureau, which has 2 governmental authorities for each region of the world. So I think there's 10 in this case. So there's 10 government bureaucrats and 25 scientists who are constantly advising the political legitimacy and the scientific rigor of IPBES processes. The plenary is a yearly meeting that happens among the 145 member states, and it's the only decisive body. This is when IPBES makes a decision, is when the countries vote on the decision. And it has to be consensus-based. It's not majority rules. So, for example, the first IPBES product was assessment of pollination. So the countries decide, they want to know, how do we incorporate better decisions about managing the ecosystem service of pollination? They make that decision, it comes down to the secretariat makes a call for experts to apply to participate in this project, but before they do the project, they have 1 year just to scope what this means. So they convene a small group of 20 or 30 specialists. The specialists have to be nominated by their home country, which is, again, a way of assuring political legitimacy. But then they also are evaluated by the multidisciplinary expert panel. So there's always this duality of legitimacy and rigor. And just in case you live in a country that's crazy and doesn't want to nominate you, 20% of experts can be nominated from civil society or indigenous groups. So there's a mechanism to go around hostile countries, for example, if you have a conflict with your country. But the important point here is that there's always this duality of scientific rigor and legitimacy. Who do you represent, and what is your academic credentials? After the document is scoped for a year to say, oh, what are we going to do with pollination, it goes back to the plenary. And the plenary says, do we accept this or do we not? Do we do this or do we not? So it's, again, another way to look at legitimacy. And once they decide to do an assessment, there's a 3-year process with all these backs and forths of external reviews, of country reviews, to create a co-produced product. So this is considered knowledge co-production because there's this constant feedback with governments until the very final negotiation in the last plenary where the countries, what's called, accept the report and negotiate what's called the summary for policymakers. So I'm sure Carlos will go into more detail here, but what I want to say is to transform something like ecosystem services or something like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment into something that's actually a co-produced product took from 1997 to 2012 to create this process where rigor and legitimacy and relevance are constantly balanced. So this is, of course, an international process, but these kinds of concepts also have to exist when we're doing any type of transdisciplinary work or knowledge dialogue with local communities. So within the best process and this idea of making values of nature more broad and not just being about monetary issues, or how do we incorporate all these different perspectives, political orientations, worldviews of different countries, because this is happening at a 145 country level. The first task was to create a conceptual framework that allowed all the different participants to have a common mental model. And in this case, where are multiple values of nature in this mental model? I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this paper by Sandra Diaz, who works with Gabriel and with me. The first issue here is the colors of the words are meant to be caricatures, so they're like cartoons. So the way different stakeholders view different portions of the model varies. So in black, it could be the way decision makers think. In green could be the way scientists think. And in blue could be the way society thinks. Of course, it's a caricature, but an important innovation here is there's not one conceptual model. There's a recognition that the conceptual model depends on who looks at the conceptual model. In this box on the left, traditionally this was called ecosystem services, but IPBES has transformed that concept to be more inclusive of particularly political orientations of certain countries who reject neoliberal thinking. So they reject ideologically and conceptually and ontologically the reduction of nature to monetary values. And so economic language is a way of thinking, and they reject ecosystem services conceptually, not methodologically. So IPBES came up with this more encompassing term, which was nature's contributions to people, to try to be inclusive of other worldviews or other ways of thinking that are not just monetary. And then a third aspect of this model is that the heart of the model is people. So it's an anthropocentric model, but it's made for decision makers. This isn't a conceptual model made by a group of anthropologists and biologists working together to see how they integrate their knowledge in a transdisciplinary project. This is a model that is made as its heart decision making. So governance, human assets are the heart of the model. And in this case, nature relates to human well-being via the intermediation or the transformation of nature's contributions to people. But in part, those decisions, those governance structures, generate direct and indirect drivers that affect nature. So that's the integration part. recognizing how decisions, governance affects nature, but is also required to mediate nature for it to impact well-being. So the example I always give for the flow, the upward flow, would be water is a part of nature. But water cannot be part of my well-being unless there is infrastructure that brings the water here, ways to keep it clean through governance structures that maintain that there aren't septic systems that go into the water. So there's a lot of human activities that have to happen for water to become a contribution to my well-being. So those are just a clear example of that. But then also those governance structures, the way I manage water affects the direct and indirect drivers that affect the water itself. So this would be IPBES's framework to start to look at what are the multiple values of nature, and in this case, recognize there are at least different ways of perceiving each box, and also the nature's contributions to people is a way to be more expansive of what those values are to people that are beyond economic values. This is the official list of nature's contributions to people, which is very similar to the list of ecosystem services you've seen. But one thing that's key here is that in the IPBES typology, one contribution, one NCP, can pertain to multiple categories of NCP. So instead of talking about cultural provisioning, regulating, and support, which is the typical ecosystem service typology, here it's material, non-material, and regulation. So in Argentina, where I live, just a very clear example of how one NCP can pertain to multiple categories. If we think of beef, cows, Argentina is very famous for making cow meat. That meat has a material contribution to my well-being via food, it's nutrition. But the act of doing a cookout in Argentina is a cultural activity, the asado, here in Brazil as well, which would be a non-material contribution. So food is a very clear example that you can't put an NCP or an ecosystem service in one category. The same thing, the same object of food, has multiple ways of being considered within this typology of NCP. It can be simultaneously material and non-material depending on the context, just like our positionality, right? But IPBES also recognizes, again, going back to this idea that there's different colors in the boxes. So we could have the IPBES lists, right? So scientists want to make lists and categories and put everything into boxes. But there are other worldviews who say, I can't separate my health from my spirituality, or I can't separate my nutrition from my identity. And so there's the recognition that the valuation of these things and the categories that are imposed is context specific. So that's another recognition of plurality. This is something that's adapted from the TEEB program, which existed for about 20 years, which was the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And they call it the value cascade, which is looking at how nature translates down into, in the original figure, this last box is called value, and it was synonymous with monetary value. But here I've modified it and say those are value indicators. And the question is, what do I want to indicate? So the NCP may be something like food, but just as we mentioned, food can support biophysical measures of nutrition, or it can support sociocultural measures of identity. So depending on the aspect of well-being that you're contributing to, you will choose the appropriate indicator, and it's not always monetary. So value is not synonymous with monetary value. The question here is which indicator of value, whether it's biophysical, monetary, or sociocultural, is appropriate for the aspect of well-being that I'm assessing. And this last point, when we do this values cascade, it automatically makes us think of social actors or stakeholders, because this isn't abstract. Different stakeholders have different relationships. So one, for a rancher, the beef is economic income and its identity. For the consumer, it's identity and nutrition. So this automatically makes us start to think of things like stakeholder analysis. And so I'm sure, how many people have worked on stakeholder analyses before? Yeah. So we're not going to do a class on stakeholder analysis, but you know that a stakeholder is an individual or a group who have some interest in common, but also the ability to operate over that interest. So one common mistake that students always put on stakeholder analysis is saying the community is a stakeholder or the government is a stakeholder. And generally that's not the case, because within the government, for example, the Ministry of Environment may have a different position than the Ministry of Production. And so stakeholders are constituted by a context. They have an interest in what, and they operate over what. So the government usually isn't one stakeholder. Different offices in the government can be stakeholders, and the community doesn't usually operate as one block. So it's really difficult sometimes for students to get to what is the stakeholder, but it's an important aspect of defining for whom. All these values are for whom, and it's rarely society or the government. We have to get to the granular level of for whom this happens. Of course, stakeholder analysis is really important because if you have stakeholders with high interest and high power, they could be key players. If you have stakeholders with high interest and low power, they could be marginalized and you could want to engage them. So of course, most transdisciplinary scientists know about this for the practical reasons. But in this case, we're interested in stakeholder analysis. What does it tell us about the values at stake and at play? So let's talk a little bit now about the findings of the value assessment. Up until now, we've set the stage and why it's important and what's happening and how it's produced. So in 2015, actually in 2012, IPBES decided they wanted to do a values assessment, and the scoping document was done. But then there wasn't consensus to do it because certain countries said there were other priorities. And I think it was actually the Global South in this case that wanted other things done first. And so it kind of stayed there for a couple years. Then they decided in 2015, I think, we started in 2018. And it was 80 people from around the world, similar to this group, actually, very similar to this group, 80 people from around the world. There was geographic and gender equity. But for the first time in an IPBES assessment, even though IPBES has always been about social well-being and social aspects, the people who were interested were mostly natural scientists. So this whole idea that ecosystem services basically came from ecology. And it wasn't until this assessment that there was not a domination of biologists. So for the first time, humanists and social scientists were the plurality. In fact, no one dominated anyone in this assessment. There were more than 200 contributing authors, and this, again, doesn't just include academic scientists, but also what are called traditional knowledge holders. And with this question too, with qualitative, quantitative, some countries literally wanted us to say, like, quantify the values of nature. But a lot of this is qualitative descriptions and understanding and mutual comprehension, and not just creating lists. And so, for example, we used academic literature that we could quantify, but we also used gray literature sources from policy documents and ILK sources, which included participatory workshops. And so you don't expect a local community to have a paper you can cite, so you have to create conditions, and IPBES has innovated in this way to create ILK strategies to elicit and validate information. And so it's not just anyone can say anything and that's local knowledge, so they now have, IPBES has for the last 12 years formalized procedures to generate and validate local knowledge that can come into the assessment. So we had over 200,000 sources, 50,000 were reviewed with 15 different protocols. So there's not one protocol. This wasn't systematic review. We had critical reviews, scoping reviews, reviews that used AI to look for trends in the literature. So it was very diverse. And of course, even with all this effort, there's still a bias towards English language production and academic production. But there were all these efforts to overcome that. One of the first conclusions is that, well, I think it's not a surprise, is that political and economic decisions do not represent the values of nature. They're representing a subset. So, for example, economic decisions tend to prioritize instrumental values, but at the same time, conservation decisions have historically prioritized intrinsic values, what we were talking about this morning. And those conservation policies may exclude other values that indigenous and local communities have, which could lead to conservation injustice, the same way that biologists lament the overemphasis of instrumental values in economic policies. But a second finding here is that there's actually a consensus globally, so it's not like we have to position this idea, if we look at all the international agreements, whether that's the Sustainable Development Goals or now the Convention for Biological Diversity, there's a consensus that this needs to happen. So what we're saying here is that governments have agreed that the multiple values of nature need to be taken into account. There's consensus on that. This isn't new, this isn't radical, we're not strange, but when we look at the decisions, they're not reflecting what their own agreements say they want to do. So, this is going to be really hard to read. So we propose what are called 4 value-centered leverage points to incorporate the diverse values of nature. And they go from shallow to deep. The easy one, quote unquote, is just to recognize the multiple values of nature. So I was talking during the coffee break, oftentimes decision makers are a homogeneous group, and even when their values are not in conflict with society, the studies we've done where I work, for example, show that they have a reduced set of values compared to society. So they may be thinking, we're including all the values within our decision-making group, but that's not reflecting all of society's values. So the first thing is just to recognize what subsets of values are being prioritized, and that's a conceptual and analytical capacity to recognize the values of nature. Then there's a practical issue, which is how do you embed values in current decision-making, the instruments we already have. How do we just do it better? How do we include more methods to include more holistic valuation within, for example, environmental impact assessment that already has a formalized procedure? But sometimes the procedures are not sufficient, and that's when we have to have the capacity to reform policies and reform institutions. So if the environmental impact assessment procedure is insufficient, what would a new institution look like that would allow more inclusive decision-making? And then the deepest level of transformative change is shifting social values, but not just shifting social values, it's aligning social values. For example, in many cases, it's not changing people's values, it's allowing their values to be expressed through actually the reform of institutions. So you may have values that you're not being able to express because the way the structure makes the decision-making happen. So aligning these social norms with the multiple values of nature. So to think through a little bit of each of these steps, to be able to recognize values, to be able to see what values are at stake and to do some kind of value analysis, we need a typology. And so we've already basically discussed the typology this morning, but in the case of the chapter that I worked on in the assessment, we were really emphatic that philosophy in this case is a methodological tool. It's not a conversation that you have over coffee. In this case, the philosophical ability to analyze what values are at stake makes a typology an analytical tool, not just a conceptual tool. So what we have here is, first of all, doing a zoom into the typology. The values of nature, a first philosophical understanding is that value has multiple meanings. And so different disciplines refer to value in different ways. Value is often synonymous with monetary value. But at a deeper level, there are value orientations which have to do with worldviews. So we talked about that already. Where is the focus of value? Is it on people? Is the focus of value on life? Is the focus of value on interactions? And that would be at a worldview level. That's a deep level of value. A second level of value would be what are called life principles. Like, what are the guiding principles of my life? Value at that what's called broad value level. So do I seek prosperity? Do I seek oneness? Do I seek stewardship? Do I seek harmony? These life guiding principles. That's a second definition of value. A third definition of value we termed specific values, and it has to do with preferences. It has to do with importance. It has to do with justifications or ranking of values in specific contexts. And so this is what we talked about already this morning with instrumental, intrinsic, and relational values. These are flexible. So if you want oneness with nature, you don't change that every day. But the way you express oneness with nature, one day may be instrumentally and one day may be relationally. So that's why one is called a broad value and one's called a specific value. It's the way you express value justification in a specific context. And then the final layer of values is what are called value indicators. And this is what a lot of economists confuse with value. People say, what's the value of something? And they're talking about the monetary value. And we're explicit here to say those are value indicators. The value is down here. It's either the principal or the specific value. And I have to choose an indicator that's appropriate for the broad or the specific value I want to measure. And it's not always monetary. And in this case, we talked about 3 indicator classes, which can be biophysical, sociocultural, and monetary. So biophysical indicator, for example, of a mangrove forest would be how many hectares of mangrove forest is there? Or how many tons of carbon does the mangrove forest capture? A sociocultural measure of the mangrove forest would be the importance of the mangrove forest for the identity of a local community, or the ranking of the mangrove forest compared to other habitats for spiritual spaces. So those are sociocultural. They're usually done with subjective rankings, like Likert scales. And then monetary would be, what are people willing to pay to conserve this mangrove forest, etc. Some typologies also use health as another category, but in our case we said health is actually a multidimensional domain. It's not an indicator, because I can measure the amount of mercury in my blood, and that's biophysical. I can measure my subjective well-being with the forest, which is sociocultural, and I can measure the economic impacts of if I die from contamination, how does that affect the economy, and that's monetary. So health is important, but it, in and of itself is not an indicator. It's a domain of indicators. So a first result here is that before we can talk about the multiple values of nature, we have to say what level of value are we talking about? And this has to do with language, right? So we're not having a dialogue of different things. Whereas somebody might be talking about, actually, Christiana and I also in the Americas assessment, we were schooled one time by a environmental economist who came in at the very end of the project as a review editor, and she told us all the work we had done for 3 years was not the value of nature. And we were like, what are you talking? We literally didn't know what she was talking about. And it was because we hadn't reduced a final numeric monetary value to our 3 years of work of what was the value of nature in the Americas. And we had done all these different multidimensional things, but for her, that wasn't the value of nature. And we were like, well, your definition of value is actually the measurement of monetary indicators of nature, but there are other levels of value that we were actually tasked by it best to evaluate. So one challenge, so the first challenge is to say what level of value I'm working at. But you see these lights that cut across the onion? We call this the onion figure. When you have certain ways of living and being in the world, you're inherently prioritizing certain sets of values. So this is another heuristic tool that allows decision makers to say, it's not that one way of orienting to nature is good or bad, but if all your policies prioritize living from nature, and none of your policies prioritize living with nature, you're going to prioritize some values over others. And then we added this fourth category. I'll show what each of these mean in a second. The fourth category, living as nature, is meant to be an all-encompassing term of non-Western perspectives where there's no human-nature separation, where I am nature. So here would be some examples. If we live from nature, we're prioritizing certain broad values like prosperity and livelihoods. We would have specific values like the instrumental use of fishery stocks. Intrinsic value doesn't really exist in this case. And the relationship of fishing to culture. We could measure that in biophysically in tons of fish, monetarily with the market value of fish, and socioculturally with the importance of fish to identity. That would be a living from nature framework. The other frameworks have to do with living in nature, where nature is basically a surrounding. It's like I'm like on this stage, I'm surrounded by a stage, but I'm not interacting with the stage. Versus living with nature, where nature has agency, and I'm interacting with nature. And then, of course, the final, where I am nature, and I am the river in this case. The point here is that different spotlights across this onion figure are going to prioritize different sets of values. The way I think and the way I live are expressions of subsets of values. And not that one is good or bad, and not that indigenous people are here and Western people are here. We always use multiple life frames, but the question is, when are certain life frames the only ones that are expressed in policy? So this is another methodological tool of analysis to think about what's there and what's not there. So now I want to give 3 examples of how this typology can be used to navigate diversity. And when we talk about navigate, we talk about it vertically. So how can moving across the onion be navigation? And how can moving within a layer be navigation? And how can understanding plurality provide more opportunities to include more diverse values for conservation? So these examples are not examples that I actually work with, and so since we have an international group here, you may say that my examples have mistakes, so that would be welcome contribution. These are theoretical examples that we've used in a publication based on the literature, so I may not tell it right. This first case is conservation of the Himalayan wolf, so the Himalayan. Working with the plurality of values within the specific value level allows, for example, pastoralists may prioritize instrumental values, conservationists may prioritize intrinsic values, but looking for that relational space is a way to say, okay, we have a third option where we may have something shared between these stakeholders. But in this case, the actual success of the conservation project was not based on that. It was based on working across the levels where the conservationists engaged Buddhist worldviews of oneness to engage, to activate on the landscape via the construction of these stupas, which are Buddhist altars. So, oh, sorry, one thing I forgot to mention. The stone circles here are pits. So the wolves were trapped in pits. Instead of trapped with a leg trap, they were trapped in these pits. And so the conservationists wanted to deactivate what they're called shandongs, which are these pits. But instead of deactivating them and destroying them, they decided to consecrate them, to make them sacred sites by adding stupas to them and activating the Buddhist value of oneness and harmony with other beings. So they were deactivated in the sense that they're no longer capable of killing wolves, but instead of removing them from the landscape, they worked with monks and politicians with other worldviews, without conservation worldviews, to activate other values on the landscape, and in this case, bring Buddhism together with traditional conservation and the pastoralists who practice Buddhism in the landscape to recognize other values beyond, in this case, intrinsic and instrumental. So there's just 2 examples of having this ability to engage plurality across levels and within a level can produce a conservation outcome. And please tell me I'm saying this correctly, if you know this example. An example from North America is what's called the Timber Wars. So anyone who's from the US in the 1990s will recall that in the northwestern portion of the country, in Oregon and Washington State, there was an endangered owl, the spotted owl, that was largely found on federal forest land. And so because of the Endangered Species Act, they had to eliminate logging on these properties to prioritize the conservation of the owl. And it created this dichotomy between loggers versus owls. And it's called the Timber Wars. But what was not recognized and what since has been cultivated is that, again, these 2 actors don't just have opposing values, they also have shared values, and in this case, relational values, because a logger cannot be a logger if there's not a forest. Their identity is based on the forest. So they may have different prioritizations, but there's also shared aspects of identity of a conservationist, and the identity of the logger was based on forestry, or the forest itself. So again, looking for spaces that aren't just differences, but commonalities. And then also so a lot of the fights happen at how do we measure this, or how do we justify it, but a lot of these fights are actually happening at the worldview level again. So being able to diagnose where the root of a conflict is allows better treatment or mitigation or overcoming this conflict. And so in this case, since the time has gone by, since the 1990s, new problems have arose. And so for example, right now, there's a fight between animal rights activists and conservationists because there's an invasion of a native owl, the barred owl, is the same genus as the spotted owl, and it's invading this place, but it's a native species, but it's invading and outplacing the endangered owl. And so now they want to kill like 500,000 native owls that are invasive, and so there's a conflict between a biocentric worldview of animal rights activists and an ecocentric worldview of conservationists who want to kill the invasive owl. So being able to diagnose the roots of these problems is another aspect of being able to use values plurality to engage conflict in a more constructive way. And then finally, if we look at the plurality within the indicator level, so for example, well-being was traditionally measured with economic development indicators. And so just a really simple and very clear, most countries now have what are called well-being dashboards, and so they have health indicators, they have education indicators, they have number of green spaces per person indicators, so there's biophysical indicators. So at the first level, looking at well-being as multidimensional allows incorporating other indicators. But the case from New Zealand is very illustrative, so I'm not sure how many people are familiar with New Zealand's, it's called Living Standards Framework, where they've done a participatory process with Maori and Pacific Islander worldviews and also taken into perspective children and future generations. And they've aligned what they measure with what people actually value as principles. And so I can't go into the details because I don't remember all the words in Maori, but these are the Maori guiding principles of life, and there's 4. And instead of talking about well-being, they talk about the tides of life. So they think of life as a dynamic process of tides. And then there's 4 principles of life that Maori guide their lives around. And so in this case, working across the typology allows saying, okay, we don't just pick measurements because we know how to measure them. So we maybe have really good accounting of certain things economically or commercially or even biophysically. We may have really good measurements, and so we debate and we fight about how to do those measurements better. But this is taking a step back and saying, are those indicators indicating the broad values that people actually care about? And so what New Zealand did was a whole participatory process of worldview and value construction at the deep level, and then said, how do we measure that? And they also worked at the institutional reform level because they linked that back to the funding of the government. So the Treasury Department, their funding is based on this new dashboard of well-being that's been developed in a intercultural and multi-worldview way. So I really recommend looking at that because I think now the right-wing government of New Zealand is trying to eliminate this. So look real quick. So going back to the metaphor of navigating, a lot of these typologies are important because they give us guideposts, but they're not static entities. And so what we really want to be able to, we talk about engaging values, navigating values. It's not just about quantifying values. And these clarifications allow you to say, how do I engage this better in different contexts? Which indicator is appropriate for which specific value is referencing which broad value? Which subset of values are prioritized by certain life frames? So this idea of not just the extremes, but also the overlaps, what we call the fuzzy boundaries, gives us space to operate and look for agreements between different worldviews, different cultures. So finally, a few things really quick that I wasn't as involved in, but I think they're relevant for you all. And again, this is just giving you introductions to things, and then you have to do a lot more work to know the details. But on a methodological level, one thing you can tell decision makers is there's no shortage of methods. The review found that there were over 50 methods of valuing nature. And over the last 50 years, it's increased 10% every year, or 40 years. There are broadly 4 families of valuation, which include direct measurements of nature, like measuring carbon, statement-based, which is surveys, behavior-based, which is what people actually do, and then integrated, which is multiple methods. IPBES also recognized that these methods are academic, that local communities also have their own methods. So they are self-defined. But here's some interesting statistics where only 5% of studies reported incorporation. Even when valuation studies, only 5% actually report that their valuation is in the context of a decision-making a concrete decision-making process. Only 1% included stakeholders. And monetary valuations, despite what biologists think, don't get taken up more. So part of the justification of ecosystem services was that we need to speak in the language of decision makers, and then they'll take us seriously. And there's no evidence for that. Economic valuations are not incorporated more than others. This is, well, the typical, there's certain biases of where valuations happen. So they're mostly in forests, they're mostly in cultivated areas. But here what I wanted to show is most valuations are valuations of nature itself. So they're really ecological valuations. They're biophysical valuations. It's traditional, it's more ecology. Only 30% are focused on quality of life, and only 4% are focused on justice. So there's some big gaps in valuation studies that people like you are interested in filling, because most valuation studies are still basic biophysical valuations of nature, or monetary valuations of nature, but from the perspective of nature, not the perspective of people in nature. This is also complicated, but you can find the paper. What I want to show here is that participation, 56% have no participation, and within the participation that was found, most is providing data. So again, low levels of participation. Oh, and the communities of justice, yeah, the most are unclear on justice. The ones that are about justice, the few studies that are on justice, most are not even clear on what justice means. So there's lots of room for better work on this. This whole area that you're interested in is pretty lowly addressed in the literature. What we can say, though, is IPBES has for a long time defined this sort of 5-step process. Most natural scientists, when they think, how do we measure things, they go directly to the methods. So you choose and apply a method. So lots of biology students that are interested in doing social work come and say, how do I do a survey? They immediately want to go to the survey. But to do plural valuations, there are 3 steps before you get to that. And so what we've been discussing here is this whole investment of time, of team building. Well, when you take that to the plural valuation assessments, first you have to invest in a legitimate process. Then you have to co-define the purpose. You have to co-establish the scope. And then, only then, the 4th step is to define the methods. So there's lots of space here where multiple values of nature, or the plural perspectives of nature, need to be taken into account in this co-design, which balances relevances, resources, and robustness, and before you even get to apply or to decide on methods. Another thing to recognize is that when we're talking about decision making, plural valuation can come in at different stages. And it's not the same, so it's not just doing plural valuation to do plural evaluation. But if I'm setting the agenda, I could be doing plural evaluation to inform. So I want to define the problem. Or if I'm at the stage of there's an actual policy decision that needs to be made, the decision makers have already said, we put this in the agenda. For example, what I've mentioned today is that the Convention for Biological Diversity, the Sustainable Development Goals, many national and local policies already say they want to do this. So you really don't need to define the problem more. It's already set in the agenda. At this stage, many problems are already at the level of, if I have to choose between different options of intervention, what are the pros and cons of each alternative, and what are the different values at stake in each alternative? So maybe I'm operating here on the valuation to design alternatives. I'm not operating on just more information to inform the problem. So being able to engage the policy cycle is a skill that most natural scientists wouldn't have, but as a transdisciplinary scientist informed by political science and social science, you would need to be able to position yourself, where am I at in the policy cycle, because that's going to determine the product that you want to produce so that it's possible to incorporate into decision making. Another finding was different stakeholders, to be able to achieve plural valuation, different stakeholders have different needs. And again, we focused yesterday on the fact that most education is about the analytical part. How do I do better methods? But methods, that's one of 6 or 7 capacities that a stakeholder needs to be able to engage plural valuation. Other capacities are motivational, bridging, negotiating, social networking, and governance. And so in terms of your training or in terms of the focus that you put on projects, don't always just think it's about doing better measurements. It's not always just about doing better analytical ability. And for a project to be successful, it would need to cover all these competencies, or at least be aware which ones you're covering. So maybe you don't need all these, but what position are you in the public policy cycle? Maybe if you just need to inform, you just need motivational and you need analytical. But if you're negotiating decisions, you need to be able to negotiate and bridge between different social actors. So different capacities are going to be needed at different areas. But again, here the typology allows you to navigate that complexity by recognizing what you have and what you may need to achieve the goal. So here, recognize there's many capacities beyond the analytical technical capacity. I also wanted to mention the issue of power and justice because that's come up several times. So within the typology of power, this publication broadly divides discursive power from structural power. And so discursive power includes things like how do you frame the argument, and structural power would be who gets to decide the rules and who gets to participate in the process. And so in this case, Paula, for example, took each of the leverage points and then said what would be an example of an action within discursive power mitigation and with structural power mitigation. And so if we just look here on, if I'm interested in reforming policies so that they're more inclusive, I would need to legitimize alternative discourses. So I could put effort into bringing in decolonial discourses, biocultural discourses, non-hegemonic discourses. That would be one action I could do to overcome power imbalances at the level of reforming institutions. And structurally, I would need to make sure that social movements are empowered to participate in that new reformed institution. So those are just two examples of engaging power at one of the levels of the leverage points. Dominique did a similar analysis with justice, and so in this case, for example, the leverage points are here on the left, and he's specifically interested in distributive justice, procedural justice, and recognition justice. Distributive justice is very clear. Plural evaluations allow you to make better cost-benefit analysis because you know what values are at stake. So you look at trade-offs, not just in monetary terms, but trade-offs across different value indicators, and who wins and who loses, socioculturally, economically, biophysically. So that's an example of distributive justice actions, that recognizing multiple values allows you to do better distributive justice decision-making. With regards to reforming policies, procedural justice means making the rules in such a way that the people who are relevant or the people who are legitimate in this process can participate. And recognition justice has to do with who's legitimate, who's valued, whose ideas are expressed, and in this case, he's relating it to shifting the underlying societal norms, because one of the things that we often, that actually I've really emphasized, and I don't like the fact that this says shifting values, because in a lot of cases it's about unleashing values or allowing alternative visions that already exist to express themselves through our institutions, which are currently repressing those expressions. So recognition justice would be encouraging the inclusion of these things that are not included so that they can be expressed and thereby shift social norms. Yesterday I used the metaphor of many of these master classes are about showing you through a window. We can't go into the details of methods, but now you know this exists, and if you're interested and you've seen through the window, you can open the door, open the window, and there's plenty of literature, there's plenty of support. This is creating a community of knowledge, a community of practice. There's going to be lots of collaborations that happen from here on out. So I invite you to continue going through, opening this window if you're interested in this little peek that we've seen today. And I'll leave with a couple positive notes. So why would I be optimistic that a plural values future is possible? When we were at the plenary for the approval of the best values assessment, the representative of the US government literally said, this is a game changer. It wasn't Bolivia that said that. It was the US government said, this report is a game changer. And only 4 years before, when we approved the Americas assessment, the representative of the Trump administration had objected to the use of social equity in a report on biodiversity. So what I want to say is, in 4 years, we went from a government that objected that social equity has nothing to do with biodiversity to a government that says, this is a game changer and the multiple values of nature have to be incorporated. And of course, in this case, the Biden administration had a whole initiative on environmental justice, and it had its first indigenous Secretary of Interior. So it is possible to change, to bend that curve, to rejecting the fact that society is part of nature, to it just being normal. Because now there is a global consensus, and now we just have to make decision makers fulfill what they've already agreed to. I think we have some representatives of government here later. So social justice is environmental justice, and that's the same thing as sustainability. Those are no longer separate spheres. It is possible to incorporate multiple values, but we have to incorporate multiple people. In the case of Latin America, we have the SPSAS agreement, who many of you are familiar with, which is the first Latin America-wide environmental treaty, and it ensures the right to information, the right to participation, and the right to justice. And so all of us who are living in countries with that treaty have the right to demand that our governments fulfill that in different ways. We have the right to information, the right to participate, and the right to justice on environmental matters. So we can do better indicators, we can make sure our indicators achieve our principles, and we can also maintain rigorous and legitimate processes. Change happens at the margin. So the countries in IPBES who are the leaders in this are Bolivia, many of them are from Latin America. Argentina, for example, is not an innovative country in this respect, but they are a rigorous country. So the one negotiator from this is a particular person, it's not the country. This person is there making sure all the T's are crossed and the I's dotted. He has a political mandate from his country, but he's also very professional. So there are ways to engage people at different levels. Countries like Bolivia or Colombia are pushing the idea of Mother Earth, they're pushing the idea of the rights of nature, but there are also countries like Argentina who are professional, and they want to do this well, although they don't necessarily push the envelope on new concepts like buen vivir or sumat causai. We are also the agents of change, and so the IPBES values assessment, as I mentioned, was the first assessment that was not dominated by natural scientists. I think it's not trivial that it was actually dominated by Latin Americans and women and trans women, and so we did things differently. The embodiment of the assessment, the way we worked, was something we were conscious that we deliberately did differently. And so I think that's what we're doing here as well. So we have to recognize our agency not as robots fulfilling a paradigm, but as creators of a new paradigm. And so the paradigm shift has happened conceptually, but now we have to implement it, and so you're the ones who are going to do that. For more information, there's plenty of, one of the cool things about this assessment was that we were weird, we were crazy, but we also published in Nature. We have a special edition of COSIST. We have a special edition of Ecology and Society. So if any of your advisors say that this is a waste of time, you can say empirically that's not true. But we also had a lot of fun, and we worked on self-care, we worked on just different ways of relating to each other, not as products, not as academics, but as people, but we also were very productive. So you can tell your advisor that it's possible. And that's the assignment for this afternoon.